So where did we leave it last time? Charles X is dead, and on his deathbed he's managed to grow Sweden to its largest ever territorial extent. However, he does not live to see the peace afterwards, since the war with Russia is only concluded a year after his death in 1660. In his wake, he leaves his 5-year-old son, Charles XI, in a regency council. And this marks a period of weakness for the Swedish state, and therefore its position on the European stage is at threat. This was Charles X before he died. The internal politics of the Regency. So there are two main parties, the militarist aristocrats and the peace party. Long story short, the militarist aristocrats won, but they became terrible governors of the country. And Sweden's neighbours knew this to be true. They gained quite the reputation as careless and easily corruptible, and this would eventually lead to the Scania War. Many other nations used a policy of subsidy to essentially hire the use of Sweden in their wars. Many of these wars had no direct benefit for Sweden itself, other than filling the pockets of certain noblemen. Most notably, Sweden was drawn into the conflicts between France and her neighbours. So at first, Sweden's alliance had been bought by England and the Dutch Republic, who paid Sweden to partake in limiting French expansion. But Sweden actually only remained in this triple alliance until 1672, when clever foreign and military policy from the French secured Sweden as their ally once again. And yeah, that 1672 Treaty of Stockholm saw France pay Sweden 400,000 Riksdaler in peacetime and 600,000 Riksdaler during war, in order to ensure that Sweden would basically join France's wars to defend their sphere of influence in the lowlands from the claims of other German states. The Scania War. So after Sweden switched sides in the Franco-Dutch War, the King of Denmark interceded in the war on behalf of the Dutch, and they led an invasion of their recently lost territories in southern Sweden. At this point, the Swedish armies were actually distracted because they were fighting the electorate of Brandenburg in northern Germany. And before the Swedes actually retreated from Brandenburg in northern Germany, they were defeated at Fehrbellin by Brandenburg before escaping. And this spelled the end of the disastrous regency of Sweden, because at this point Charles XI is now of age and he can control affairs of the state. A quick rearrangement of armies meant that Sweden had to withdraw from northern Germany to defend Sweden proper, because as we know, Denmark had recently launched an invasion of the Swedish mainland. But actually, military success was now seen for Sweden, because Charles XI actually turned out to be a competent military commander, and he led a successful counterattack against the Danes in the south, sending them back to Denmark. But overall, the war became quite the stalemate, and Sweden lost the war at sea. Brandenburg then took this opportunity to occupy Swedish possessions in Pomerania and Bremen-Verden. These are all on the North German coast. And eventually all Swedish continental possessions were actually lost. And at this point the Swedish Empire is actually only saved by France. The French managed to negotiate a peace where almost all of Sweden's previously held land was returned to it. So the treaties of Lund and Saint-Germain-en-Laye secured all Swedish lands except eastern Pomerania in northern Germany. So I'd probably consider this to be a very narrow and lucky escape for Sweden. So how would they rebuild the nation? Well, Charles XI knew that if he wanted to maintain an empire, he'd have to significantly strengthen the Swedish state's ability to generate money. And he'd also have to cut down on the power of the nobility within his own country, since, as the previous regency had actually demonstrated, they could not be trusted to get the job done. But Charles actually went a step further than his father had with his quarter reductions. So Charles XI approaches the Riksdag on the motion of the estate of peasants. The Riksdag is basically the Swedish parliament. And it was decided that all lands taken by nobles in recent land acquisitions of Sweden that generated more than a certain sum of profit per annum should actually just revert to the crown straight away. And in that very same Riksdag, it was decided that the king would not have to be bound by any constitution, but only by law and statutes. So essentially the king had become sovereign, and now Sweden was an absolute monarchy. Charles XI spends the rest of his life carefully managing the process of recovering and revoking land, and managed to reduce the national debt of the country by a total 3/4, which is quite amazing. He eventually died in 1697. Once again, Sweden was left with a young king. Charles XII assumed kingship at the age of just 15. Understandably, the enemies of Sweden once again smelt blood, especially since the reform of Sweden into an absolute monarchy surely meant that the Swedish Empire would fall under the leadership of an inexperienced 15-year-old teenager. In 1700, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Lithuania, Saxony and Russia launched a simultaneous invasion of Swedish possessions. Denmark-Norway launches an invasion against the Swedish ally of Holstein-Gottorp, located just south of Denmark. Poland-Lithuania marched north into Livonia and laid siege to Riga. Russia marched into Ingria and Estonia. The stage was set for the defining war of Sweden's history. Being the closest country to the nation of Sweden, Charles felt that it was important to make sure that the Swedish homeland could not be threatened. So he focused on Denmark-Norway. The Swedish navy cleverly outmaneuvered the Danish navy and landed a Swedish army on the Danish capital of Copenhagen. A naval bombardment and a Swedish ground attack took the Danes by surprise, and under international pressure from the Dutch and the English, the Danes withdrew from the war under the Treaty of Travendal. In just over 3 months, the most threatening country for Sweden had been defeated. Now they had to turn their attention to defending the Baltic. King Charles XII quickly redeployed his army to his eastern Baltic provinces to try to break the siege of Narva in Estonia. There seemed to be no hope for the Swedes, as the Russian army that was encircling the fort numbered about 3 to 4 men for every Swedish soldier. Nonetheless, the quality of the Swedish army and the military genius of Charles routed the Russian army completely and sent them packing back to Russia. Following his defence of his Baltic lands, Charles decided to turn south. The next problem for him to deal with was the Duchy of Saxony in the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania, who at the time were actually ruled by the same King Augustus. The Battle of Riga was the first of many victories for Sweden in this campaign. The most notable victory was in 1706 at Fraustadt, where the Saxons, Poles and Russians were more than double the Swedish force. A successful double envelopment manoeuvre by Swedish General Reinfeldt enabled the Swedish victory, and 8,000 men were killed and 5,000 taken prisoner by Sweden. The Treaty of Altrandstadt in 1706 actually deposed August as the King of Poland and Lithuania, and instead installed a puppet king named Stanislaus Leszczynski. And now Saxony and Poland and Lithuania were out of the war, and Sweden only had to face Russia. In Charles's time fighting in Poland, Russia had actually retaken control over Ingria again, and had started the construction of a new fort, which would eventually become St. Petersburg. Rather than retake these lands, Charles decided to make a march on Moscow from Poland, which, needless to say, is an incredibly long distance away. Initially, the Swedes made quite good ground, and town after town fell to them. But the Russians then implemented a policy of scorched earth, where they burned land they retreated from, to prevent Swedes from being able to scavenge from supplies. But Charles's eagerness meant that he did not wait for any of his supplies, and on his march forward, his troops actually suffered from a lot of attrition and a loss of morale. Eventually, they were actually forced to turn away from their path to Moscow and marched south into Ukraine to forage for supplies. The Swedes laid siege to the town of Poltava, and this is where the Russian army met them. This was the first major defeat that changed the war for Sweden, because Sweden didn't really have the men to replace its army, being such a lightly populated country. About 7,000 Swedes were killed and 3,000 were captured. Charles was then forced to retreat into the Ottoman Empire and was exiled there until 1715, when he could make his return. This marked the end of the Swedish Empire, or almost that. The Russians had basically conquered all of Finland by 1714 during Charles's exile in the Ottoman Empire. And they still built St. Petersburg, which was coming along quite nicely for them. Saxony and Denmark-Norway rejoined the war again after Sweden were defeated at Poltava. When Charles returned to Sweden in 1715, he tried to again invade Norway, actually, to force them out of the war. But this failed, and he was eventually killed at the siege of Fredriksten in 1718. And in 1721, Sweden made peace with all of its enemies in the Treaty of Nystad. This ended the period of the Swedish Empire. Sweden lost all of its Baltic states, and they lost even more on the North German border. But they did retain Finland. Sweden would never again become a great power, and now we're reduced to a regional status of power. So if you enjoyed this series, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe, because it means you won't miss any of the content I put out, and it really kind of helps the channel to grow. But I will see you in the next one.